Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to see some old faces and some new faces here tonight for what I think is going to be a really an intimate evening with my good friend, David Robinson Morris. So much for joining us. This is our third event of the 22-20 academic year of programming for the program of Creativity and Consciousness. And putting together this series of presentations, and we're grateful to have this nice community of people who have been so responsive to us. So welcome and thank you for being here. It is a particular delightful honor to have the opportunity to you, my friend, Dr. David Robinson Morris. I was lucky enough to participate in a summer session at Contemplative Mind and Society in 2022. It was virtual, of course, towards the pandemic. And boy, we were happy to be together, virtually or not. I was just immediately captivated by David's enthusiasm, his warmth, and his very compelling vision for a reimagined future. During that summer session, he spoke frequently of the eminence of the human spirit and our collective responsibility to reimagine systems that can support healing, personal liberation, transformation. And tonight he's going to continue on that theme, inviting all to share in his radical vision of possibility. I have to tell you, putting together a class this afternoon, I got out an old notebook. I didn't even that you would be in it. And I had the notes from that talk and I laughed. I was underlining things. So I've been talking David all day, holding you in my heart. Dr. Robinson Morris is a PhD, an author, a philosopher, a social human rights advocate, activist. He is an educator, a philanthropist, a organizer, a DEI practitioner, and an administrator. He is the founder of Reimagilution, which is a strategic consulting firm working at the intersection of policy and practice. Dr. Robinson Morris is also the former, executive director of the Contemplative Mind and Society, oversaw the difficult process of sundowning an organization for an administrator who was able to be courageous enough to walk that walk. And I hope that that's something he'll touch on today. Contemplative Mind and Society is an organization that I would imagine many of us are familiar with. It's a community of contemplative practitioners and scholars holding lots of webinars and various series and summer sessions and all kinds of good things. PhD in educational leadership and research with a dual concentration in higher education and curriculum theory. He's an education specialist with a certification in leadership and a focus on applied research, measurement, and evaluation from Louisiana State University. Welcome to our humble community. We are thrilled you here, David. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you so much. Good evening, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you. And a huge thank you to Molly and Ed for the invitation to tonight's conversation, discussion, talk regarding the intersection of racial justice, spirituality, consciousness, and education. And as Molly alluded to, I'm more than sure I'll be able to share some lessons learned during my tenure at the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, or CMIND as it's commonly known. More than all of those things that Molly read about me, I'm just trying to be a good human being. And sometimes that is more difficult than we think it is. And we'll talk about that probably tonight as well, right? But I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. As is my tradition, let's begin with a bit of grounding in the space together. So I'll ask you to find a comfortable posture, to relax your bodies, Release the tension of your muscles wherever you find yourself in the world tonight. Plant your feet firmly on the ground. Relax your shoulders. Take a deep breath. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Take the deepest breath you've taken all day. You are here. Relax as you listen to these words. Freedom is our birthright. Ease is our resting post. Courage is the virtue most needed in this moment. Thank your body. Thank your body that has cared for you through these moments of death and dying. Celebrate your heart that has beat for you. Relish in the wiggling of your toes. Melt into the rhythm of your breath. Take joy. Take joy in the itch of your nose. You are alive. Thank your body that has sustained you through trauma. Thank your body that has carried you through a global pandemic. Hundreds of thousands have perished, and you are here. You are here. Freedom is our birthright. Ease is our resting post. Freedom is our birthright. Ease is our resting post. Healing is a battle for peace and for liberation that we must all engage. Freedom is our birthright. Ease is our resting post. If you cannot imagine it, you cannot have it. If you cannot imagine it, you cannot have it. Imagine yourself swimming, resting, rising in the pool of love. Freedom is our birthright. Ease is our resting post. When you're ready, come back to us with one heart. Thank you, and Ashe. This talk is named tonight for one of my favorite poems from our dear sister friend ancestor, June Jordan. The title of the poem is called Calling All Minorities. And it reads this: hey, come on out wherever you are. We need to have this meeting at this tree, ain't even been planted yet. On this Wednesday, after midterm elections in this part of the world, it sometimes seems like hell is empty and all the devils are here, to quote Shakespeare. But hope, that condition of the soul, remains. we are hopeful. It is ever present and enduring, especially for people of the global majority. However, what history has taught us is that hope without action is dead. We are in a moment, I believe, of grand transformation. We, along with this world, are being transformed. Collectively, we find ourselves planted here on this third rock from the sun in the now, under conditions that strain our growth and threaten our erasure as human beings, as a planet, and most especially for those of us who identify as persons of the global majority. Grounded in contemplative justice and growing from the rhizomatic nature of radical imagination, like our dear ancestor and sister friend June Jordan, I'm calling us tonight to come out and have this very necessary meeting under this tree that hasn't even been planted yet. These trees cannot even be planted because the groundwater is poisoned. And yet they will be planted to purify and to transform. This poison is not a poison that kills immediately, but one that slowly atrophies everything it touches. It poisons the soil, infects the tree, and produces rotten fruit. In this country and across the world, this poison is the white supremacist ideology that scholar Charles Mills tells us has shaped the globe, and its byproducts of racism, xenophobia, capitalism, and patriarchy. We are all taking rest under and eating from a poison tree. Where I live in the southern United States, I'm coming to you tonight from New Orleans, Louisiana. These poisons have materialized in the daily lives of Black people and people of the global majority through extreme economic insecurity, high rates of student debt, issues in voter registration and voter turnout rates, barriers to post-secondary educational attainment, and an unequal representation in the extrajudicial murders at the hands of American law enforcement. Not to mention the hourly microaggressions that one suffers from by the hands of a false meta or grand narrative about who Black people are and who people of the global majority are in this world. While I would love to tell you that these issues are not being reified in contemplative circles, I can tell you firsthand that they are. Whiteness and white supremacy culture are totalizing, even in environments that claim otherwise. White supremacy culture, which scholars Okun and Jones describe as a series of characteristics that institutionalize whiteness and Westernness as both normal and superior to other ethnic, racial, and regional identities and customs, is alive and well within our institutions. To say it another way, white supremacy culture explicitly and implicitly privileges whiteness and discriminates against non-Western, non-white standards, traditions, and ways of being. We understand this very well in contemplative studies, which for years, as you all very well know, has called for a decolonization of the cognitive imperialism expressed within the field and within practice. Contemplative practice is an indigenous tradition that is open for all, but not without acknowledging its roots. Practice allows us to experience and to understand a multidimensional world that moves the center of being away from the self to community, to the collective, that moves each of us from I to we. However, these understandings don't negate socialization, They don't negate embodiment or the very fact that our being in the world and our consciousness is shaped by our experience as racialized, gendered, political, and spiritual human beings. Method. Contemplative practice is a method, and method is always an ontological decision. And our being in this world is always political. Following the verdict of Kyle Rittenhouse, shortly after I took the helm of the organization in November of 2021, I released a statement to the C-Mind community, which read this. Stick with me, it's a long. Personally, quote, personally, I had to take a moment to feel, but not be consumed by anger at the jury's verdict. Sacred anger and righteous rage are effective tools of transformation. Audre Lorde reminds us, anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification. For it is in the painful process of this translation that we identify who our allies are, with whom we have grave differences, and who are our genuine enemies. The process of coming to see is a painful one. It continues, Kyle Rittenhouse is a symptom. As a Black person, the coverage of the trial and the verdict painfully increased my already heightened awareness that white supremacy is enshrined in the criminal legal system. I'm intentional here not to use the word criminal justice because justice, like equity, is a process and an outcome. If the process is flawed, then so too the outcome. Far too many people of the global majority, for far too many of us, justice, true justice within a system saturated in white supremacist ideology is a pipe dream. This appears even to be true for white men thought to be in alignment with the mattering of Black lives. Given the grand racial narratives that persist, we know all too well that if the shoe were on the other foot, and Kyle Rittenhouse happened to be a person of the global majority, this verdict and his treatment by the court would have had very different outcomes. In this country, racism denies people of the global majority permission to protect themselves from white people. We are trapped in a system that has no faith in our innocence. Resistance is a practice, anger is sacred, and our work is very clear. Our work, friends, in this moment is to hold the intention for peace, to hold the intention for justice, and to hold the intention for more equitable practices in this country, and then do what we can in our corners of the world to make our collective vision a lived reality. So as you sit your pillows, dinner tables, and desk chairs, I'm imploring you to practice the courage of speaking truth, to practice the courage of challenging the racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, and/or homophobic remarks that spew from our colleagues and the very people we love so dearly. Resistance as a practice leads us toward transformative action, collective healing, and necessary liberation. I believe very deeply that human freedom and human flourishing, our collective liberation lies in our ability to restructure the mind, to think new thoughts, to conjure new possibilities, to dialogue across difference, and to revel in the grace of the good thing. Let this moment move you to deeper understanding, greater action, and the cultivation of becoming more of what we want the world to be, end quote. Now this statement, which I think is quite good, by the way, was met with relative silence. A few thank yous, and some surprising feedback from members that essentially said, shut up and stay out of our politics. who then promptly unsubscribed from all CMI newsletters. Those members happened to be white and largely male, but it was a reminder for me of the poison, right, that we talked about as the fruit of this tree, and perhaps the use of contemplative practice as a performative oneness. Right? So as the new leader of this organization, after this statement came out, I was forced to ask myself these questions. What does it mean to be contemplative and to do contemplatively? What does it mean to recognize our shared humanity and to practice justice? Given CMI's focus in higher education, how might we engender a genuine curiosity in our institutions of higher education, among our colleagues, and in our students about the generative complexity of contemplative practice? My favorite question. What is the role of grace? This great mystery that meets us right where we stand, but does not leave us where it finds us. What is the role of grace in our organizational work? How might we personally and organizationally protect ourselves from being reasonable men and women? That's to say, how might we privilege the need to not adjust to environments, but force the environment to rise to and push the limits of our collective imaginations? How might we begin to practice living, being, and doing in radical amazement? I don't have any answers to any of those questions, so don't think you're going to get any answers tonight. Still working through, right? I'm still on that plateau in the middle. What I do know is that contemplative practice, for me, in thinking through this sort of tree analogy, right, is the level of sediment that assists in purifying the poison groundwater. And contemplative action is the tilling of the soil to make it ready for planting. Practice allows us to prepare for the planting that is not yet, but must be to sustain us in life's seasons of drought and pestilence, suffering, grief, and death. Reciprocally, contemplative practice allows us to engage in deep joy and abundant gratitude when the pastures are verdant and the harvest is bountiful. Practice allows us to be at home with ourselves, even when home feels like it's in shambles. Contemplative justice, for me, is the fruit of this practice. Grounded in my understanding of socially engaged Buddhism and the lived African diaspora practice of Ubuntu. For me, contemplative practice is the cultivation of home within ourselves and the world through deep, active, intellectual, and embodied engagement with self, others, the seen and the unseen, toward a transformative ecological understanding of complete interconnectedness. The only way out of what I consider to be this mess, right? This poisoned ecosystem. The only way out is through together. As a Black American and those in the African diaspora, we live and understand Ubuntu, or the realization that human beings make and are made responsible for one another. We live this in our daily practice. We in the African diaspora have held on to this sense of mutuality through enslavement, the legal enforcement of Jim Crow policies, brutal denigration, and the complete denial of our humanity at the hands of other human beings. We understand, first of all, that all of life is bound together by a divine and loving force. And secondly, we understand the interdependence of all life. Another writing while I was at C-Mind was on this message during Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which got some interesting responses to it. It was a message entitled "The Contemplative King," right? And the Contemplative King basically says this about practice, and those of us who understand practice. It's that societal change can only be brought about by the internal struggle for transformation. Right? The individual and collective internal struggle for transformation. A transformation that requires us to search our own hearts, to bend and peer into the corners of our own unknowingness, to search out anything that hinders us from love, being loved, or loving, and to encounter the shadows of our internal selves in the mirrors of our own hearts before we can earnestly work to bring about beloved community in the world. Like Dr. King's integration of the visionary and the practical, which he blended so well, is an urging to be ye transformed by the renewing of our minds and the unhardening of our hearts. For me, again, this is contemplative practice, which forms contemplative being and catalyzes contemplative action, which is deep, troubling, and peace-evoking. It's truth-telling, it's anti-oppressive, it's anti-racist, it's justice-emitting, it's equity-centered. It's understanding our shared humanity toward the creation of the beloved community. I have to tell you, we have not achieved this ideal. We're working toward it every day, but we've not achieved it, right? And so I was reading King's writings as I was preparing this statement. And basically there was one writing that he just said, I'm tired of this, right? Like, I can't do this anymore. There are 3 social ills: racism, poverty, and militarism. Right? And I can't do this anymore. We are no longer addressing these things, but we're allowing these 3 things to maintain power and control through the exploitation of those who suffer. Like King, I'm tired of living in this reality too. In fact, like Dr. King, like the contemplative King, I'm impatient for social change. I'm impatient for full civil rights. I'm impatient for the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act at the time. I was impatient for an end to the killing and extrajudicial murders of Black and brown human beings. I'm impatient for the dismantling of systems and institutions and ways of beings and bodies of thought that produce suffering, that produce division, and that maintain inhumane treatment. I'm impatient for environments that feed the flourishing of the human spirit and fuels the flame of limitless possibility. I'm impatient for that. I'm impatient for a global recalibration of our relationship with earth and nature. I'm impatient for the eradication of poverty and an end to war. I'm impatient for an educational system that forms the mind and shapes the heart for the love of knowledge and not for workforce development. The question becomes, are our hearts not broken enough that we begin to do differently, to do radically, to dismantle or to transform any system or institution that creates, prolongs, or exacerbates human suffering? That's the question. One of the other major lessons I learned during my time at C-Mind was the disconnect between contemplative practice and contemplative action. I sat day in and day out and listened to wonderful people pour out their hearts about the conditions in higher education and how human beings were being treated in the world. I served as thought partner to theorists and scholars seeking a better way forward. However, what was glaringly clear to me was the lack of action in and on the work. While practice asks us to sit our pillows, to dance our dances, to beat our drums, and release our consciousness from our bodies and re-enter them differently, where was the action? If, as theologist Peter Finley remarks, justice is the outflow of a broken heart, then we in the contemplative community should be being and doing at all times to improve conditions for all beings. Why had we not removed our eyes from our navels and lifted them and our hands to engage in transforming the world? Why hadn't we done that? Echoing my dear friend James Baldwin, who's over my shoulder here, I call him Uncle Jimmy. That's how close he is to me. I come to understand that this is the charge, the dangerous moment we are living in, when everything must be re-examined, must be made new, when nothing at all can be taken for granted. So I began to focus on contemplative justice, which also got me a whole host of emails from a lot of lovely white women complaining that I'd introduced another concept when folks didn't even understand the general concepts. Right? And who was I to do that, was the question in those emails. I'm going to do it anyway. As I define it, contemplative justice is the active cultivation or deployment of the inner witness or critical consciousness of the self, of the self imbued with the ability to observe the movements of our own hearts and the systems we inhabit, with the ability to recognize oppression and colonization in all of their forms and manifestations, and then finally to actively work to disrupt internal oppression and injustice for collective external transformation. Right? What does that say? It says, until you do your own work, you cannot do the work of the world. That's what it says. The ultimate goal of contemplative justice is liberation. What I mean by liberation, I mean that it is to learn and unlearn, to connect and create, to labor and to love in ways that will enable us to glimpse, to touch, and to sustain this collective freedom where everyone thrives with access to resources, with agency and no fear of violence, with the right to rest and to play and to create free from exploitation. Collective liberation does not forget. It remembers, it unveils, it makes a claim that goodness, justice, and healing are possible, while also not hiding from the human ability to be inhumane. It is a labor of love justice and an outcome of collective transformation that, again, is not yet, but must be, if humans are to live together on this planet, if we are to repair it and one another, or at the very least, if we are to do no more harm. If contemplative practice begins the process of purification of poisoned groundwater, it's racism, individualism, white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, then contemplative justice tills the soil, aerates it, readies it to plant new trees. Trees that are liberated from the poison that atrophies and produces the fruit of radical healing and racial justice. As Sean Ginwright reminds us, healing is the capacity to restore our humanity and care for ourselves and others, even in the midst of fear. Or as I often say, healing, radical or otherwise, is a battle, an individual and communal undertaking toward wholeness by telling the unvarnished truth and confronting trauma. For Black people and people of the global majority, and all people really, this trauma is historical, it's intergenerational, and it's epigenetic. It limits our capacity to flourish, to connect, to love fully, to think outside of what is, and makes each of us stranger instead of brother friend and sister friend. A good deal of my work at Seamind at the end there centered on healing. It asks us to explore the places and the spaces where harm occurred, where we were hurting, and to name the pain. What I know about naming things is that anything you name, fortunately or unfortunately, you can control. You have power over it. This work asked us to stop agonizing and to begin organizing. I hope it's not, but this may be the work of our time. This work toward contemplative justice, a contemplative justice for collective liberation toward radical healing. This healing requires us to use our imaginations. Each of us is being called to imagine and reimagine a world free of poisoned groundwater. Imagination is pure possibility, pure possibility. And it's actually what moves us. It moves us to purify the groundwater, till the soil, and begin to plant trees that haven't been planted yet, but are the subject of our meeting today. Imagination will help us make possible a world where justice prevails, where all are liberated and our hearts are healed. We are being called to imagine a new orchard with gorgeous trees that bear life-sustaining fruit for collective sustenance. I'm going to ask you to take a moment to imagine with me. What does this world or your corner of the world look like, free of the violence of oppression, of racism, of xenophobia, of homophobia? How do you feel in this world? What does it feel like? Does it feel like the summer sun kissing your skin? Does it feel like the first rain of spring when everything is new? Is it still like winter or in transformation like fall? What does it smell like? Who's there with you? Now take a moment to imagine what you can do to bring that vision to fruition and begin to do it. As I close, the opportunity here is to think of our lives, our being on this planet, as revolutionary theater, which is also the title of a seminal essay by Amiri Baraka, which I adore. It's how I try to live my life, with the understanding that I shall only pass this way in this body at this time once, right now. Imagining this orchard not yet planted. I want to paraphrase the essay. Baraka writes about the revolutionary theater. The revolutionary theater should force change. It should be change. The revolutionary theater must expose. The revolutionary theater must teach them their debts. It must crack their faces open to the mad cries of the poor. It must teach them about silence and the truths lodged there. The revolutionary theater should stagger through our universe, correcting, insulting, preaching, spitting craziness, but a craziness taught to us in our most rational moments. People must be taught to trust true scientists, and that the holiness of life is the constant possibility of widening the consciousness. And they must be incited to strike back against any agency that attempts to prevent this widening. The revolutionary theater must show horrible coming attractions of the crumbling West. The revolutionary theater must take dreams and give them a reality. It must isolate the ritual and historical cycles of reality. but it must be food for all these who need food, and daring propaganda for the beauty of the mind. This theater should be a theater of world spirit, where the spirit can be shown to be the most competent force in the world. Force, spirit, feeling. The language will be anybody's, but tightened by the poet's backbone. And even the language must show what the facts are in this consciousness epic, what's happening. We will talk about the world and the preciseness with which we are to summon the world. This will be our art. Art, like contemplative practice, is method. The revolutionary theater is shaped by the world and moves to reshape the world, using as its force the natural force and perpetual vibrations of the mind in the world. We are history and desire, what we are, and what any experience can make us. Our revolutionary theater will show victims so that their brothers in the audience will be better able to understand that they are the brothers of victims and that they themselves are victims if they are blood brothers. Our theater, our world, our orchard, not yet planted, will tell the story of Black aliveness and full humanity, of the unfurling experience and relational encounter of our capacity to manifest whole, fully human lives that exceed representation, that are grounded in spirit, energized with imaginative possibility, suspended between dark place within and lustrous place where true spirit rises and where we are one. Contemplative practice is a method and an ontological decision. It is an understanding of how I be and how I come to know in the world. It requires that we use everything in service of being doing better, being doing more, being doing deeper. Through the practice of contemplative justice, we come to understand our consciousness, our seedlings planted ideally in fertile soil through our interactions with self, others, and the world. As we begin to water these seeds of consciousness, they begin to grow through right relationship and mindful attention. We are the trees. We are the trees not yet fully realized, who are planted in our understandings of the world and ourselves, seeking out non-poisonous, fertile ground in which to deepen our roots. We are the trees not yet fully realized, having meetings about, dreaming about, and imagining a world for trees that haven't even been planted. So I invite you again, and I've combined two of my favorite ancestor sister friends, June Jordan and Lucille. I invite you again to come on out wherever you are. We need to have this meeting at this tree, ain't even been planted yet. And come and celebrate with me what we have shaped into a kind of life for which we had no model. Born in Babylon, non-white, what did we see except to be ourselves? We made it up, and we are making it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay. One hand holding tight to the other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill us and has failed. Every day something has tried to kill us and has failed. Be well, be still, trust in the infinite, remember our shared humanity, be community, and be of good courage. Thank you for listening tonight.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
That was really powerful, and I just even before your talk, I was sort of strategizing. I wanted to make a few comments, and but you actually really tied some things together for me. And like I've been saying, I would love to compare notes on a couple of fronts. I'm not sure if people know the history of the contemplative mind, the Center for the Contemplative Mind in Society. But it was formed in the late 90s. And I happen to be, at some point, we definitely have to compare notes, because I was among the first fellows in they had this thing called the Contemplative Practice Fellowship Program in 1997. And that was, so I go way back. I mean, I sort of been, my engagement was very sporadic by the time you joined. I think Molly, it's the same thing. But I think, and she and I have, talked a lot about the sort of the culture of the organization, and all that kind of thing. But here's a couple of things, and so you mentioned Amiri Baraka, and this is such a, that is sort of linked into what I was strategizing anyway. So probably some people know that, Amiri Baraka is like a very prolific writer on Black music, jazz, and one of his, like, at least in the music realm, his book Blues People is a real kind of a landmark, little concise, but just incredible. So when you mentioned Amiri Baraka, it linked to my area is jazz, and so one of the so there's a couple of threads here. We have the Jazz and Contemplative Studies curriculum, which went into play in very controversial in 2000. So that was kind of like in the early days of contemplative mind and everything. You might have heard like sort of references that, again, it was like a real moment and all that kind of thing. It was very exciting. And but here's the thing with there's some parallels here. So and this is what it was so powerful to hear you just kind of sort of bridge this, within the contemplative justice thrust. There's these two realms. I mean, you have the interior and the exterior, and it's very easy to say that they work together, but I mean, you really, you're living that, and it's a challenge. But so here's two things that can help us in this space. So in music, we're dealing with every music school. By the way, Michigan has one of the top music schools in the country. So is it like every music school we're dealing with? We have our DEI flags up, and we have our Black Lives Matter flags up. But we don't have our Black Music Matters flags up. There's a very interesting thing here, because jazz straddles the racial justice imperative, as I call it. And by the way, a little self-plug here, I wrote a book called Black Music Matters again. But jazz straddles the racial justice imperative. And what I want to see, I want to use the word spiritual. I'd be using it, am I right? I didn't use it for a long time, but in recent years, it's like, I'm just using it. And I want to encourage people to, because I'm looking around at my friends like Frank Huser and June Boyce, and we kind of met, and other people that I know in this. I think it's time to use that word, because the word, and your comments on language were so, this is such an important thing, in terms of, I love what you said, okay, when you can name something, you can deal with it. And even this word contemplative, this is what the Academy does, doesn't it? We come in and we have, whether it's this or that, it's DEI now, which is actually meaningless. DEI is an absolute farce, an absolute joke in terms of anybody's really serious about doing something. But even the word contemplative out in its own way, it's become, it became sort of put in a box and everything. And, so I'm rambling a little bit, so I'm going to tie it up. But I just wanted to, and maybe you could reflect a little bit if what I said conjures up any thoughts, but we'll definitely open it up for questions too. But I just couldn't resist, sort of tying those threads together. We have a contemplative movement that is basically should be raising the bar in terms of the activist thrust, and is in the Academy, and it's not doing that. We have sort of a music studies progressive movement is totally dropping the ball in my view. But anyway, I want to thank you. And if either if you have reflections, or we could just open it up if people want to just raise the E orange hand, however you do that, I always forget, or you can just ask a question in the chat too.
Yeah, what I'll say to what you just said, Ed, was, the moment something becomes an industry, the moment it moves from movement to industry, it loses its power, right? It loses its ability, in my opinion, to affect the spirit in real ways, because you've made something now into a product that has to yield certain outcomes financially, right? And you take away the real generative matter of it, right? Which is the complexity of it. And it's the thing that causes all the questions, right? In my experience of capitalist systems, are these things moving from movement to industry or to a commodified product. We don't like complex. We like simple, right? And we want the ability to say there's an input, there's an output, and the input can be commodified and the output has a value. And we want that return almost immediately, when that's not how any of this works, right? Not how it works. And I'm sure in jazz, it's the same, this jazz is a spiritual practice, right? Improv is the highest form of creativity, right? And music is its own language and tool of communication, whether it's with one another or whatever spirits may be, right? But the moment we take this thing that has higher purpose and bring it down into our use, the moment we make it a technique, right? The moment we make it a tool of something, it loses that sort of higher realm thing, if there is a higher realm, you know what I mean? It loses the spiritual aspect of it, in my opinion. I'll stop there because I can go on about that all night. I can keep rambling all night.
Okay, if I may. So thank you. That's very, very interesting. And even your tonality was wonderful. It's very interesting the way you delivered it. Thank you, David. And I just wanted to build on this idea of contemplative mind and as you said very beautifully, the word contemplative itself sort of bounds it in a process or object perspective. And yoga has suffered from that idea too. It's been productified in yoga pants, yoga studios, billion-dollar industry. You start using those terms, and at some point you forget it's not so much simple and complex as much I would say simple, surface, and deeper. The ephemeral, the depth is lost, but similar thing that it's it's the sense of taken over by financialization of the whole thing and making an industry. Fascinating phenomenon, and it's one thing to name it, another thing to do something about it.
Yes.
And I see June has a question. June, you have to unmute.
Not really a question, it's a comment.
Oh, yeah.
I think
Yeah.
two things I think I would want to say. Was an inspirational session, and thank you very much for that. That capitalism deals only in products. It doesn't care about process. In a sense, slavery is the ultimate expression of capitalism, and it still exists because it doesn't matter how you produce something, providing the product is good. And it seems to me that all the contemplative practice and spiritual practices have always been about the process and the way you go about it. And that really needs to be redeemed. I mean, in academia, in a sense, we have to keep turning out articles. It doesn't matter whether we're, abusing people to get the material or abusing ourselves and the amount of time we have to spend. I mean, we're caught up in the same the same whole business of it. In a sense, getting a PhD, it's getting the PhD that's important. It doesn't matter how you do it and the processes. So I think that's a very important part. The other thing, which I think is very encouraging about what you've said, is that the whole contemplative spiritual movement is often about, I often call them spiritual goodies that somehow you get that makes you feel better. It's like a bottle of Smarties that you can occasionally go into and get something nice. But the medieval mystics that I've studied, people like Hildegard of Bingen, the question always is, if you have this experience, what do you do? It must always be rooted in some practical action. And I thought, you know, you did that so beautifully today, the notion that it's not enough to get the good experience, the peace and the sense for yourself. It must in the end result in action for justice. And I've heard so much on contemplation, as Ed knows. I mean, it's an area that I listen to, and in the COVID, I've listened to even more. There's an awful lot about, you'll all feel better if you do it. Well, it's not actually about that. It's whether everybody feels better if you do it, which means going out and embodying it in some way. And, you know, thank you for reminding us of that, because I think there's a lot of time that it gets sort of lost. And so thank you. I've enjoyed staying up late to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, June. I'm glad it was worth it, June. Thank you for that.
Comment. I was struck by your tilling the soil, which I love. I love that. You know, I teach a course on consciousness, creativity, and identity. And the first semester that we integrated meditation into that course, it's curriculum, I had teachers come in to teach my students to meditate. For many years, they were professional transcendental meditation teachers. One of them said to me, teaching this group of young people was the equivalent of teaching peacemakers that I taught in Ireland, because their stress was so high. The amount of frustration and anger and fear that they were sort of letting off and talk that was happening throughout that semester was so hard. And when I look back on teaching experience, and I've done this now for 11 years, two or three groups a semester. So this is, you know, over 1,000 young people. I look back at those early years of that practice, and it felt like clearing the fields of boulders. And since then, it's gotten easier, but it gets easier, harder, and it gets easier, and it gets harder. And you have to sit in a place of commitment to practice, which is tilling the soil, live that presence in that class, and be okay with the awkward of all that stress that comes out for those people who are just starting that process. What is grace? To me, that is the grace. It's the allowance of the transformative moment of suffering. It is towards a new time where we move beyond suffering. As a way, we learn our lessons, and we strive to learn our lessons through love, through connection, and through practice. And the practice is hard.
Yes.
And it is tilling the soil. And I think you were quite eloquent in speaking to that. And I appreciated it, like June said, as a reminder to my own practice. So thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you.
India Cook here. Can I be heard? Am I being heard?
Yep.
You are. We'd love to hear from.
Excellent. Dr. Robinson Morris, thank you so much for your work. Really appreciate it very much. One of my questions is, how far reaching is the contemplative justice movement? Is there a way of knowing how global this is, particularly in these times? And then I have more questions for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know I don't know if it is global, to be quite honest. I think there are people doing some of this work. They are doing it in pockets, and not necessarily in any sort of organized way, right, for impact. Here in the States, the folks that I know to be doing this work are really people of the global majority, who feel, yes, Ed, let's start a movement. We need to, please. Who feel very strongly and who have experienced life as, I hate to use that word, but as an oppressed person, because their personhood is oppressed, not their spirit, right? It's a different thing.
So a question here is, how important is it then to know how many communities are being reached and educated in this way, to know what else needs to be done? And what kind of implementation has been put in place to know what needs to be done?
Well, for me, India, none yet.
Okay.
We're working
All right.
toward it. We're working toward it. I think, this work for me started at the very end of my tenure at CMI, right? And it started in the midst of everything sort of unraveling across the country. But it also started in the middle of our organizational decline. And so the ability to get the word out, to really push contemplative justice and to really begin to do the real work of movement building around contemplative justice was really hindered due to what I call organizational blight.
Sure.
Which
Sure.
is what we experienced what I experienced at CMI.
Well, one of the things you mentioned was the role of grace, which really touched me very deeply. I was very happy to hear that. And then on the other side of that scale, I can't help but think about the role of fear, which I think is just such an extraordinary foundation for the racism and the inequities and marginalization that we have experienced globally once again. So how would you say one would reach that demographic of people who are so severely marginalized in regard to education, finance, employment, healthcare? We're worried about paying bills, we're worried about what school we can send my kid to. And if I'm talking too much, I'll stop. But I'm just curious about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, I love that note around fear as a motivator, because it is, right? But what I also know about fear is that it's inverted desire, right? So there are theorists who will, and actually one was a revolutionary, oh my God, what's his name? Egerton Cleaver, who was, a huge Black radical. And what he said around this notion of fear was that fear essentially is that it's inverted desire, right? And the example that he used is sort of white male fear of Black men, right? Now it's a radical example, so you'll excuse me, but it's his example, not mine. What he said was that actually white male fear of Black men was inverted desire. It was unrealized sexual desire, right? So the question for me becomes, how do I get people to raise to the surface their desires instead of sitting constantly with their fears, right? That's part of the work. The work around reaching folks who are worried about everything else in life is that this is life, and that this is the only one that I know that you'll have. And there are consequences to every action. And if you're able to live with those consequences, then good on you. But if you want something different, if you want to be differently, if you want to feel differently, if you want to understand the world differently, then we have to do something different, right? And that's a very sort of surface level answer, Indy, and I can give you some deeper things, but I think I think this is also part of the conversation that we have to be having within contemplative movements. How do we reach folks who are not in our sanghas? How do we reach folks who are not coming to our classes? How do we stop having these damn classes for payment, right? And open it up to everybody, because it should be available to everyone.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Miss Fatma looks like she wants to say something.
I think you have to turn on your audio.
Unmute you.
There we
There we go.
Uh-oh.
Hmm.
Let's see, can we unmute her?
Pardon me, ma'am. I don't know if we can hear you quite yet.
Okay.
Fatma,
There
can
it
you?
is. Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I'm Fatma Müge Gökçek. I'm originally from Istanbul, Turkey, and I am a sociology professor at the University of Michigan. My last work was on the denial of the Armenian genocide, denial of violence. That's what I'm working on. And now I wrote that book, and now I'm doing a comparative study of Kurds and Armenians in Turkey with Native Americans and African Americans in the United States. So I want to develop a global model of minoritization. How does one become minoritized? And I'm surprised that I sort of literally arrived at where you are as a consequence of trying to find a way in which to study these 4 cases in a way that is pertinent to the world and what's going on in the world today. I think with respect to that, since I also teach students or people, I want to say 2 things. In order to make contemplative thought relevant, one has to somehow attach it, and so in a way, to a contemporary concern that kids are having. In a way, that is how you sort of connect. So if you don't say fear, you say, you know, any one of the phobias that they're facing would be one way of doing it. So I would do it through the students. But that won't be enough. I mean, I always think the problem is that we always preach to the converted, and we always focus, as the speaker also said, much more on sort of the victims or the ones who are marginalized, whatever. Well, that keeps the power structures intact. What one needs to do at the same time is to get sort of white racists, not all whites, obviously, white racists to acknowledge what's been going on in their society. I mean, you know, we're at this juncture, I mean, with the Republicans, I mean, nobody in the United States wants to publicly say there is systemic racism. I mean, to me, that's appalling. And not only that, but, you know, people have to be called out for being racist. These voting practices, these gerrymandering, whatever. I mean, this is all racism, fair and simple, and nobody is willing to call that because the whites do not have the framework within which to understand. I don't think we're going to get any change once we get that going. What's important about contemplative thought that could apply in this instance is that you are able, through contemplative thinking, to think about and envision the future. That is what makes it, and people, politicians, whatever, successful. If you can share with society where we're headed, where we want to go, how it would be, and how these things will change. Now we're constantly regurgitating problems, problems, problems. Yes, we all know we have problems, social problems. That's all what we've been talking for the last 30, 40 years. What about solutions? You know, how will we go into those solutions? I think that's what we do, and I would do a 2-pronged one. On the one side, you know, working with the students, and on the other, sort of working with these sort of groups that are closed. to get them to see things. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you. It was very, very informative, and I like the way you used Ubuntu. I also came, by the way, to Africa and Ubuntu through India as well, because that is initially where civilization first started. That's why I started the human existence in Africa. And then, of course, from there it goes to India. And from India, it comes to Europe. I mean, and what Western European modernity did was bypass both the Indian connection and also the African connection. And then instead, just look at the Caucasian connection, which of course is neither here nor there, because those people there were not Europeans. They were Asians and Africans pretty much. So that's how I sort of realized that we had to bring all these ideas together, like you did with Buddhism. And ultimately, I mean, Buddhism is, I think, it also derives from African, ways of contemplating, because that's where humans first came to being. It's that simple for me, but I thought I'd share those with you since we're working on similar things. Thank you.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to look up your work, because now I'm like, okay, I want more. All right. I'm going to look this up.
Yes, and I'm very interested in Native Americans for that reason as well, because there is the possibility of maybe an alternate or parallel being, because we don't know how people ended up in South America. I mean, we all think they came through the Bering Strait, but if there are independent ways, I think they may have gone directly from Africa to South America, one or the other, that we haven't talked about. But if that's the case, Africa is still the center of everything. Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like Ms. Ketra wants to say something. Please welcome.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this. Thank you so much. First, Ed, thank you for this invite. Like I'm the sports person, so I'm kind of like the anomaly. I just think Ed is one of the coolest people I've ever met on the planet, and anything Ed's doing, I just kind of want to tag along, be a part of it. So I am absolutely delighted to be a part of this conversation. And I think it's really interesting when you talk about, tilling the soil. So I think about that, tilling the soil, and we talk about when it becomes institutionalized, it loses its real authentic power, right? And so I think all of our challenge is, in some way, and pardon me because I'm just thinking out loud. I just had surgery, so I'm a little bit medically induced, but I know what I'm saying. So just be patient with me, all right? But I think part of it when we're tilling the soil is to understand how to do so using the master's tools, even though we're doing it with our own consciousness. And so what I find the challenge is maintaining a sense of oneness, right? Maintaining a sense of wholeness in this contemplative practices that you so eloquently described and challenge us to do, but trying to find a way to do that to disrupt the power. And what I find is we have to do that, again, tilling the soil in many ways, using the master's tools, because therein lies the power, but doing so in a way that still makes us feel whole. Like you've heard, what profit is there in gaining the world and losing your soul, right? But we're trying to gain the world and keep our soul all at the same time. And so that's what I think this is so powerful, the way you've weaved all this together. I really enjoyed this conversation. And so my point is, I think the challenge is to find a way to do what we've been challenged to do by Dr. Robinson Morris, but in a way that allows us to maintain a sense of wholeness. So we don't feel like we're gaining the world and losing our souls, because we got to use the master's tools to disrupt the master's house. So those are just my medicated thoughts.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a difficult thing. Well, let me say this, it's not difficult. It's a learned experience to become a subversive radical, right? To work in ways that seem like you're going along with the flow, but you're actually swimming against the grain and making it look effortless, right, while doing so. And in that process, it may look like you're using the master's tools, but what you're actually doing is you're chipping away at the master's tools bit by bit. right? So that the master's tool is broken by the time the master goes to use it, right? On you. You want it to be broken. And that's the key, right? The other piece to this, there's a really old book called Freedom Dreams by Robin D.G. Kelley. And it's talking about the Black radical imagination. And one of the pieces in that book, I think in the opening by Sonia Sanchez, she says that we think revolutions are these huge, overturnings of things that happen in one fell swoop. When revolutions are small tactical maneuvers toward a vision, toward a shared and collective vision of how the world could be. Right? That's the key. And sometimes, I'm sitting too with Fatma's words around engaging whiteness in the conversation, which is very necessary, right? But sometimes I'm also not willing to engage in the delusion that is whiteness, right? I wrote a piece a long time ago, got me in a lot of trouble, that talked about the psychosis of whiteness. And how there is a completely alternate reality to what is actually happening. And as a Black person, especially in the South, right, the proximity to whiteness has allowed us to study, understand, evaluate, explore all of those words, whiteness. And so I had a conversation with a former boss, former because I could not, she was a master and I could not deal with her. But our conversation was, because of who we are, we have had to study whiteness for our survival. And so I know every eye twitch, I know every hair flick, I know every scowl, I know it all. I know what it all means because I've had to study you for my survival. And in turn, you know nothing about me. So you're already the subversive in an environment that's not meant for you because they don't know anything about you. And if you look at it in that way, you have all the data. You have the advantage in that situation because you already know the moves. Right? Okay, I'll stop there because I can go on about that all night too, and then I'll sound like a crazy person for real.
Yeah, it looks like a couple people want to respond to that. So Miss Alyssa, if you'd like to speak, and then Fatma, I see if you want to speak after that, that would be great.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I've got very low bandwidth on the internet. Thank you so much to everybody that's organised this and to David. It's been a very powerful time listening to you. Thank you. It's raised a couple of thoughts for me. I'm a composer and musician based in Melbourne, Australia. I've been working a lot with climate scientists and also with children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so much of what you talk about resonates, but in a different world, different area. My reflections are, what I've been thinking about a lot recently is active listening, which speaks to being a musician as well. But I think it's a political thing too, that to truly listen and to listen with imagination and curiosity, to come to understand things. Because for example, I'm not a scientist, so I have to listen with imagination when I'm working with climate scientists. And similarly, I can't walk in the footsteps of the disadvantaged children that I work with, or indeed the Indigenous knowledge holders that I listen to, but I can listen. And in that listening grows imaginative responses between us. And I feel like that in a very small way is what I'm practicing. And it's beautiful to come and learn and hear more about contemplative process, because I feel like all the artists I work with, genuine, can I use that word, in a way are practicing that. But I have questions too that I can't resolve, which is that anchoring that you talk about, which is to name something gives you power, but also to name something somehow gives it stasis. And I wonder, there's a tension there, and I wonder what your thoughts are about that tension, about gaining power by naming, but the very instant that you do that, it kind of anchors it in a way that means there's less of that beautiful fluidity. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is a tension, right? And I think about this. I have a new puppy. He's a year old. He's an all black golden doodle, and he's 70 pounds. And his name is Coltrane Monk. And from what I read about Coltrane and John Coltrane and Thelonious Monk, he acts just like. So a little unpredictable, very lovely, right? He is jazz, right? And sometimes I realize that I am not listening with my jazz ears to this other little being, right? But I wonder, is that his personality? Like, was that the personality that he was born with as this little being? Or did I make that manifest by naming him Coltrane Monk, right? That's a very small way of sort of this tension, right? But he also could not tell me what his name was, so I had to name him something. But there is this tension between naming something and having power over it, right? And allowing the thing to be the thing in and of itself, right? And philosophers talk about this all the time, right? The thing in and of itself. We go back to Descartes and all those folks, and Kant, and this is always a tension, right? But as a human being, I'm also recognizing my own limitations in the thinking. Right? I am reared in a Judeo-Christian understanding and a very Black Catholic understanding that our role in the world as human beings is to name and take ownership over things that are not like us. Right. And so there's always this me having to check myself at every turn, right? To say, okay, do I believe that thing that I was taught about human beings being superior to everything else or having dominion over everything else, right? I have to always check myself there. I don't have any real answers. I'm still working it out, right? But what I know in the realm of spirit, right, is that if I name an issue that I'm having in the spirit realm, then it identifies it in a real way and makes it known that I know what it is. Does that make any sense? And then in some way in spirit, it can be controlled, right? Now, it doesn't mean that needs to be, we've done it with human beings, right? We've done it all the time. And we see this, we can go back to the records about enslavement and see that people's names were erased and given new names, right? This is part of that dominion over, right? And so I'm still working out the tension between, pushing back against systems that have dominion over in an oppressive way and wondering the possibility, is there a way to name something and not own it? Right, or not have to take ownership of it in that way, in a way that lords over it, if that makes any sense. So I'm still working through it. I have no real answer, but that's what I have tonight. Without a glass of bourbon, that's the answer.
Thank you.
Well, if I may just add to that, which you put beautifully, I would bring in the difference there between knowledge and experience. I think what's, feminist theory sort of talks a lot about experience, and that is, of course, what's been marginalized by Western European modernity. As a consequence, that's where I sort of started and looked into how I could bring experience into this whole way of sort of processing the world. I mean, that's one way of doing it. The other one has to do with when you're doing it, how much of the tools do you use or not? I mean, I totally get the tools, especially Audre Lorde, and bringing it down. Of course, you have to take the hegemonic down. But the problem is when you are using their tools, do you also then copy their behavior and actions? That is the problem. The tools don't come. They come coded with things, and that is, I think, what the problem is. That's why it may be better to see if there are other tools that the Western European modernity has not included, like Ubuntu, or like, Hindu philosophy, or things that have been marginalized, mysticism, Sufism, I mean, things that are not in there. And because those too can be tools, just like the West did transform it, we can also use those tools to transform the world. But I think what's very crucial there, and we're going on with Alyssa, what Alyssa said in that context, is that when we're doing that, I think I like Du Bois's double consciousness idea, because the important thing is what the whites do not have is that they do not have a double consciousness. What they see and what they want to see are the same thing, and they cannot tell the difference, and hence the perversity when they try to apply all of that to other people who are not like them, because they're not even aware that what they have do not apply to the others, and they also don't know what the others have either, because that never mattered to them at all, at any time. I mean, I teach about us getting into the Iraq war and, Afghanistan, and I come from the Middle East. I mean, we went in there knowing nothing. I mean, literally nothing. And then, of course, the American society was duped, thinking they had weapons of mass destruction when they didn't, because they know nothing about the rest of the world. I mean, ultimately, I think it's going to bring us down. But from our vantage point, I think it's having this double consciousness. In my case, I come from a totally different society. I'm now living in this one. So I have a different perception. Or if you have on gender, sexuality, it could be anything, disability, creativity. I mean, these are all things that I think we can use that creative tension that we have in ourselves as we try to belong, or at least participate in more than one world, more than one way of doing things. That probably is going to lead us forward, is at least what I think in sociology, that is. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to come in, your use of the soil images I thought was interesting. And one of the things I've been writing about and working with a great deal is, I use one of the indigenous peoples of the US who writes, do the trees talk?
Mhm.
Of course they do. It's just that white people can't hear them.
Yeah.
And I've been using a machine called The Sound of the Plants, which actually was invented in Italy. And basically there's a connection with the leaves and a connection with the soil. And then the sound of the plants, the vibrations are made audible. And we've been using these as the basis of improvisation. And the three of us have been improvising once every fortnight with a harp and a drum and the plants.
Mhm.
And I mean, lots of questions are raised about what the sound is, but it's actually proved for a little group of meditation people, the notion that this week we're working with a yew tree, and the next week we're working with the calathea. But the notion also of restoring, as Bernie Krause writes in the Animal Orchestra, not having soundproof rooms to record, but recording outside so that you've got the wind, you've got the sound of the animals, that in a sense that we've even excluded all of that speaking and vibrating natural world, which would have been part of both the African traditions and indeed the First Nation people. And the notion of what we've made music exclusively human, but actually there's a chance now to open it up and hear the music of the spheres, call it what you will, the music of the earth. And I think that that's one way of restoring a relationship in some way with the other than human world, which we've lost. And I think some of the feminist theologians in particular have said you can't destroy the master's house with the master's tools, that actually you need new tools. That would particularly be true, I think, in the area of mental health, and somebody used the word psychosis. That definition is just a cultural construct. And in terms of spirituality, what we would call a psychotic episode would be a call to be a shaman or a call to be a mystic. So in a sense, there's a whole new way of looking that we've lost or systematically destroyed, actually, I would say. But I think the opening up of using other tools to the natural world, as well as to the way in which others, there's a huge movement in the UK of looking at mental health and the definitions of mental health that have actually persecuted the ethnic minorities, because the way the world is constructed is different. It's a different way of looking at the culture, not an illness. And so, I mean, you know, thank you. I think it's a whole area. How the other than human world sings and makes music is an important area. And thank you for using those metaphors, because we use it as metaphors. Then actually, as you say, we can actually go out and do it materially. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.
June and Fatma and Ketra and all of the people who've made wonderful comments, and I saw Rowan's comment in the chat bar as well. I want to thank everybody for being here. We have to let David get back to his contemplating and reimagining a better world. We're going to keep him up all night. He'll be too tired to think of beautiful ways for us to live together. I also have to give a really loud shout out to our friend Maeve, who is our tech extraordinaire, who often, before any of the rest of us say anything, pulls out our favorite lines of the talks, puts it in the chat bar, and gets us going in an infectious kind of way. She's a student, and so I think it's just a pleasure always to have you with us, Maeve. So thank you. If you want to say anything.
It's so much of a privilege and a blessing to listen to this. Even as I was listening to this talk, I was like thinking through my life and like what I believed as a youth and what I'm learning, and just being around all these incredible people in college. Like, this is the reason I always sign up to work these shifts, is because I get to hear from amazing speakers like today and to just really think about what's going on. And I love the how we talked about whether when you name something, you can control it, but also you enshrine it and you memorialize it. And then there's also the necessity to break down those names and change it. That's just such a powerful message. And I really can't say enough how much I enjoyed tonight's talk and discussion. And thank you so much for having me. I'm always going to be here, hopefully, and then just read out comments and stuff. So thank you again.
Thank you, David. Any last comments for us as you go off to the twilight?
Do your work. It's my last comment. Do your work. And big, big thanks to you, Molly and Ed. This is wonderful. And I made a post the other day about needing to find my tribe, and I think I found them. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
David.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we want you. We want you, David.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good to see everybody tonight, and we'll send out an email for next time. Thanks a bunch.